Ethan, a 42-year-old war veteran, believed he had finally found peace when he bought an abandoned dog rescue shelter beside a frozen lake in Montana, the one place he hoped could silence the echoes of war. Ranger, his wise and loyal German shepherd, was the heart of that hope, strong, healthy, and steadfastly devoted. But that fragile peace shattered on a single winter afternoon. Just hours after drinking from the calm, glassy edge of the lake, Ranger collapsed, his powerful body twisting in violent convulsions across the cold concrete floor. As Ethan held his only friend in trembling arms, a chilling realization set in. This was not nature. This was not an accident. It was a warning. The place he thought would heal him was hiding something meant to destroy him. If you want to hear how one dog uncovered what an entire town tried to bury, make sure to subscribe and stay with us until the end of this story. The wind moved like a pale ghost across the frozen lake, carrying whispers of winter through the empty hills. Ethan Walker gripped the steering wheel of his weathered Ford pickup, his gloved hands stiff, his breath fogging faintly against the windshield as he approached the old property. At 42, he carried the weight of wars he never truly left behind, scattered across his weary blue eyes, the faint scar along his right jaw, and the silver threading through his dark hair. He wore a faded green military-style coat, frayed at the cuffs and lined with stubborn memories. That coat had survived sand, smoke, and silence. Now it faced snow. In the passenger seat sat Ranger, a German shepherd of 4 years, powerful but gentle, with eyes like deep amber glass, alert, wise, almost too knowing. His sable coat shimmered with gray and cream strands, his ears erect, his gaze steady. Ranger didn't simply look at the world, he studied it, the way soldiers do when peace feels too quiet to be trusted. Ethan had seen him listen to silence before. He trusted those ears more than most men he had served with. The snow crunched under the tires as the truck rolled to a stop. Ahead stood the abandoned animal rescue shelter. Weather-beaten, half swallowed by wild grass and snowdrift, its wood panels worn like old skin, its red paint faded into pale maroon. The sign, Haven Creek Animal Rescue, hung crooked, barely holding on to the last surviving nail. The roof sagged, gutters bent, and the wire fencing around the kennels had rusted, dull and orange like dried blood. Still, to Ethan, it felt like the first place in years that didn't push him away. He stepped out into the brittle air, boots sinking into frost-hardened ground. Ranger followed, his paws making soft impressions in the snow, tail curling once with curiosity. Ethan stood still, letting the cold creep into his bones, waiting for something inside him to ignite, to feel like home. It didn't, but it didn't feel like war either. Maybe that was enough. Just as he knelt to remove debris from the kennels, the gravel road crackled behind him. An old pickup sputtered to a stop, coughing out gray smoke. From it stepped a man in his late 70s, thin but sturdy, with a posture shaped by decades of labor. His name was Hank Miller, Ethan remembered from the property paperwork. Hank's face was a map of lines and creases, weathered and deeply tanned from sun and wind. His white-gray hair was combed back neatly beneath a worn brown cap. His voice, when he spoke, was raspy yet kind. "You're the new man taking over this place?" Ethan nodded, rising slowly. "Trying to," he replied, with a hint of cautious warmth. Hank studied him, eyes sharp, like someone who had learned to read people long before reading books. "Cold here," he said softly, glancing toward the lake. "Sometimes too cold." Ethan followed his gaze to the frozen water, silent and perfect as glass. Ranger stood at shore. Ethan sighed, studying Hank the way dogs study truths. Hank's gaze shifted to the dog. "Smart eyes," Hank said, nodding at Ranger. "Good dog's better company than most people." Ethan faintly smiled. "He's done more for me than most people ever have." Hank's expression turned somber, eyes lingering again toward the lake, the distant silhouette of metallic buildings just barely visible beyond the trees. "If you're staying here," he murmured, "just keep your dogs away from that water." And just like that, he tipped his cap, returned to his truck, and drove away, leaving a riddle in the snow. Ethan stood still, unsure whether it was a warning, a memory, or simply the rambling of an old man. But something in Hank's voice felt real, like the kind of truth people only speak after losing too much. Later that afternoon, when Ethan and Ranger explored the back of the shelter, the lake shimmered silently through a veil of bare trees. The surface was smooth, undisturbed, beautiful in a cold, distant way. Ranger stopped walking. His ears twitched, his gaze fixed on the lake. He didn't bark, he didn't growl, he simply watched, like he knew even silence had secrets. That night, in what would become his home, Ethan sat by the cracked window, Ranger curled beside him. The lake glowed faintly under the pale moonlight, almost pulsing with a breath of its own. Ethan whispered to no one, "We're not here to run anymore." Ranger's tail thumped once, and for the first time in years, Ethan let himself believe it. The pale winter sky lay heavy over Bozeman, casting a gray hush over the land where snow wore silence like a cloak. Ethan had been mending the wooden fence behind the shelter, his breath rising like thin smoke, the rhythmic tap of his hammer echoing softly across the frozen emptiness. Ranger, usually attentive and close, drifted toward the lake, his paws leaving perfect prints across the snow's unbroken surface. Ethan glanced back occasionally, watching the German shepherd's nose twitch against the cold air, as if he were listening for something beneath the ice. The dog moved with purpose, but not excitement, more like recognition. The lake, once simply a backdrop, now held a presence of its own. Ranger approached the jagged cracks that had begun forming at the water's edge, where thin ice layered over a sheen of half-frozen water. He dipped his muzzle carefully and lapped from the surface. Ethan almost called him back, remembering Hank's warning, but something held his voice, a moment too late. That night, Ranger lay unusually still in the dim shelter office. Ethan had built a small fire in the iron stove, but its warmth felt weak against the creeping cold. Ranger's breathing grew shallow. His amber eyes flickered with confusion, not fear. Then, suddenly, his body seized. His muscles convulsed violently. Froth escaped from the sides of his mouth. His legs thrashed against the cold concrete floor. Ethan's heart lurched. He had seen injured soldiers tremble like that, trapped between life and something darker. "Ranger! Buddy, stay with me!" he yelled, his voice cracking as he knelt beside him. His hands, which had once patched wounds under gunfire, now shook as he tried to steady the spasms. Ranger's body jerked, breath shallow, eyes glazed with pain. Ethan didn't think, didn't panic. He lifted the dog into his arms, sprinting into the night toward his truck, his boots skidding across ice, his breath burning like fire in the frigid air. The headlights cut through blackness as he drove toward town, tires slipping across icy roads. Ranger lay beside him, limp, barely breathing. Ethan kept one hand on the wheel, one hand pressed against Ranger's ribcage, whispering, "Please, just hang on." The Promise Creek Veterinary Clinic was a small brick building on the edge of town, always warm-lit at night. Inside, Dr. Emily Carter was working late. She was in her early 30s, auburn hair tied loosely into a ponytail, freckles scattered across her pale skin, and soft brown eyes that always seemed to carry more empathy than judgment. She was slender, but carried herself with quiet confidence, shaped not by muscle, but by resilience. She had grown up in rural Montana, surrounded by injured strays and lonely animals, and she never quite stopped trying to fix things that couldn't speak for themselves. When Ethan burst through the clinic door, she immediately took charge. "Put him on the table, now!" Her voice was calm, but firm, trained to react in crisis. She inserted IV fluids, injected anticonvulsants, checked vitals. Her hand gently pressed over Ranger's heart. Her brows tightened. "This isn't natural," she murmured, more to herself than to Ethan. "Not bacterial, not viral." She glanced at the still shaking dog. "This looks like toxin exposure." "Toxin?" Ethan's voice was flat but strained. His jaw tightened. "You mean poison?" She paused, nodded slowly. "Industrial grade," she said quietly. "Something designed to stay hidden. It attacks the nervous system." They exchanged a look, one that meant far more than words. Ethan felt the air thin around him. He thought of the lake, Hank's warning, the silence. By morning, Ranger was weak but stable. He lifted his head, eyes foggy but alive. Ethan sat beside him through the night, exhaustion sinking into his bones, but he didn't leave. Something inside him had shifted. Not anger, not fear. Something colder, resolve. When the sun finally crawled across the frosted window panes, Ethan followed Ranger's faint paw prints through the snow, back to the lake. There, half buried beneath ice and reeds, he saw it. A metal pipe, barely visible, dripping clear liquid into the lake. The snow around it was stained faintly gray, the ground dead in an unnatural circle. A secret, a wound, a reason to be quiet. He collected a sample, sealed it in a jar, and brought it to Emily. His voice was low but steady. "This is what they used. This is what poisoned him." Emily looked at the glass vial. She believed him before even testing it, but her expression turned heavy, bleak. "It doesn't matter," she said softly. "You're right, but this sample means nothing." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean? Proof is proof." She met his gaze with quiet sorrow. "Not here, not against them. Whoever did this, they know the law better than we do." Ethan looked down at Ranger, who lay quietly on a blanket, eyes open, watching the lake in the distance as though he still heard something beneath the ice. And for the first time, Ethan felt like he wasn't leasing land. He had stepped into a war. Clouds hung low over Bozeman, heavy and unmoving, like the sky itself was holding its breath. The lake lay still, a sheet of dull silver, silent and guilty. Ethan stood at the edge of the road, Ranger resting at his feet, his amber eyes alert, body still weak but spirit unbroken. Ethan had knocked on 6 doors that morning, spoken to 6 families. Fear answered every time, not anger, not disbelief, just fear. Some didn't open the door at all. Some opened halfway, eyes darting past Ethan to scan the street, nervous, guarded. Some whispered, "We know," before quietly closing the door. Not because they doubted him, no, they believed him too much. This place wasn't silent because nothing was wrong. It was silent because everyone already knew. Only one house didn't turn away. It stood at the southern edge of the lake, an aging apple farm with red barns, leafless trees stretching up into the colorless sky, and wind chimes that sounded like distant church bells. The Gomez farm. Ethan remembered the name, Miguel and Laura, mentioned by Hank once, with respect. He approached the gate, Ranger walking close, his ears swiveling with alertness. Miguel Gomez, a man in his early 40s, emerged from the barn first. He was broad-shouldered, with sun-browned skin and streaks of gray in his black hair, a man shaped by hard seasonal labor and stubborn endurance. His eyes held exhaustion, but not defeat. Laura followed, a slim woman with warm olive skin, dark wavy hair tied loosely behind her head, and intelligent hazel eyes that seemed to read people deeply before speaking. She held a mug of coffee between cold fingers, and she didn't look surprised to see Ethan. "You're the dog shelter man," she said quietly, "and you're not here to talk about dogs." Ethan nodded. "Not just dogs." Miguel's jaw tightened. He motioned toward the small wooden table under the old apple tree. A large elderly dog rested there, an old golden retriever Rottweiler mix, his coat faded to cream and gray, eyes cloudy with age. He lifted his head, wagged his tail slightly, but didn't stand. "That's Bruno," Laura said, placing her hand gently on the old dog's head. 15 now. He used to jump straight into that lake every spring, was never sick a day in his life. Miguel's voice came low, steady but edged with anger. "Last spring, he walked through the shallow edge of the lake. Just walked, not even drank. By nightfall, he couldn't move his legs." He paused, scratching gently behind Bruno's ear. Same seizures, same collapse, same silent suffering. Ethan felt something in his chest tighten. Not surprise, but confirmation. He looked at Ranger, who sat quietly, watching Bruno, as if recognizing something familiar in his fatigue. Laura stood and walked toward the orchard. The trees, though leafless in winter, showed signs of struggle, not from cold, but from something deeper. The bark on some trunks was cracked unnaturally. Leaves from the last season twisted and curled. The soil near the lakeside edge was dark. Not the rich brown of healthy land, but grayish, stained as if something seeped into it. "We've been using that lake's water for years," she said, "but last year the leaves began to curl, then spots, then rot." Miguel added, "Doctors said our son, Diego, just had allergies." His voice dropped, but his skin, it blistered every time he touched the water. No speculation, no superstition, just facts. Sickness, soil decay, animal suffering, water that hurt without warning. For the first time since he found Ranger convulsing on the shelter floor, Ethan didn't feel alone. That night, in the warm, dim light of the shelter's kitchen, Ethan, Emily, Miguel, and Laura gathered around the old wooden table, maps spread before them, thermos of coffee steaming gently, Ranger resting quietly at Ethan's side. Emily, her auburn hair messy, face pale with a mix of exhaustion and resolve, unfolded field reports, water quality assessments, veterinary records, soil contamination charts, documents she once used to try and save her own family's farm in Wisconsin. She didn't save it, but she had learned how to fight. "We can't go to court yet," Emily said, "but we can build proof, proper proof." So they formed a plan: cameras, trail sensors, motion detectors. Ranger, though still recovering, would accompany Ethan, his instincts sharper than any machine. The Gomez family offered the old watchtower near the orchard edge, a vantage point overlooking the lake's southern bank. The first 2 nights were uneventful, only wind, silence, and the faint hum that sometimes drifted from the far side of the lake, where North Star's facility loomed beyond the mist. But on the 3rd night, something changed. Ranger stiffened. His fur rose along his spine. His ears locked into direction, toward the lake. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He just stared. Ethan followed his gaze, and for the first time, they saw it. A truck, dark, unmarked, its headlights off, moving slowly, silently, along the frozen dirt road behind the trees. It stopped near the lake edge. 2 figures emerged, faces unseen, carrying thick hoses. One knelt by the ground, and under the faint glow of the moon, they began to release something into the lake. Miguel whispered, "Get the camera." Click, static, grainy shadows, far away, faces obscured, no license plates, silent, but real, not rumor, not fear, not just stories. For the first time, their words had shape: a shadow, a truck, a hose, a deliberate act. Not enough to prove, but enough to begin. Snow fell with almost deliberate silence, cloaking Bozeman in a white that looked peaceful only from a distance. Up close, it felt like camouflage, nature quietly covering tracks, hiding truths. By now, Ethan could read this silence the way he once read sandstorms in Afghanistan. Silence didn't mean safety. It often meant someone wanted it that way. The first warning arrived without words. It was early morning when Ethan walked into the shelter supply shed, expecting to refill food containers for the dozen rescue dogs now living there. Instead, he stepped into the sharp stench of petroleum. Every bag of dog feed had been slashed open, ripped brutally, as if clawed by something angry. The grain was soaked in motor oil, slick and black, forming trails along the concrete floor like veins of poison. Ranger lowered his head beside him, furs bristling, not in fear, but recognition. This wasn't random, it was deliberate, a message. 2 days later, the second blow came, not to the dogs, but to Ethan. A letter from the local bank. A loan he was depending on to repair the shelter, the only loan he had, was now under review. No explanation, just the start of financial strangulation. A strategy Ethan understood all too well. You don't break a man like him with fear. You break him by taking away everything he needs to protect what he loves. Across the lake, the Gomez family suffered their own silent attack. A corporate supplier canceled their entire apple distribution contract with no warning. Without it, their farm would likely collapse before spring. Miguel didn't say much when he told Ethan, but his silence was different now. Not fearful, not defeated, just tired. The kind of tired you get when you're forced to fight a war you never declared. Then Sheriff Caldwell arrived at the shelter. Mid-40s, lean but soft in the middle. A man who tried to look authoritative, but mostly looked exhausted. His sandy gray hair curled at the edges beneath his wide-brimmed hat, scattered facial stubble framing a jaw once strong but now hesitant. His voice was low, too calm for the situation. He didn't even step into the shed, just observed from the doorway, pen never touching the notepad he held. "Best advice you'll get from me," he said, avoiding Ethan's eyes, "is to leave it alone. You're digging into something too big. Bigger than this town." Ethan's jaw tightened. Bigger doesn't always mean stronger. The sheriff hesitated, glanced at Ranger, then at the lake. His voice softened, almost like a warning from one soldier to another. "I've seen what happens when people challenge them. They don't fight fair." He left without writing a report. Ethan watched his taillights vanish into white. Ranger stood beside him, growling, not angrily, but knowingly. That night, the shelter felt different, not like a refuge, but like a checkpoint. Ethan sat at his worn wooden table, a dim lamp casting long shadows across the room. In the corner, a tall steel gun cabinet stood open. Light reflected off metal and memory. He rested his hand on the Mossberg 500, its weight familiar, its purpose clear. A part of him, a part he thought he had buried, whispered he was ready to fight, to retaliate, to make someone hurt. That old voice had no patience for cameras or evidence or patience. It wanted to act. He held a shell between his fingers. Real ammunition, lead, lethal, the kind that ends conversations forever. For a moment, he felt the warmth of war again, the terrible warmth that comes when you know exactly what you're capable of. Then Ranger walked in, quietly, slowly, his fur illuminated by the faint lamp glow, the dog's ears lowered, not in fear, but in something almost like plea. His amber eyes met Ethan's, steady, calm, asking a question without words. If you fight like them, how will you ever prove you're different? Ethan stared at Ranger, breathing heavily. Then quietly, he put down the live round. Instead, he reached into the lower shelf and lifted a different box, small, plain, printed with the words, flexible baton rounds. Beanbag shells, non-lethal, controlling, not killing. He loaded the shotgun deliberately, not like a soldier preparing for war, but like a guardian preparing to stand his ground. The next night, with Ranger walking beside him and Emily's sterile sampling kit strapped to his back, Ethan crossed the frozen lake under moonlight. Snow crunched faintly beneath his boots. The surface of the lake shimmered like a frozen breath, cold but alive. They arrived at the pipe, half hidden in reeds and ice. He collected soil, water, took time-stamped photos, GPS coordinates. Ranger stood guard, silent but unwavering. Back at the clinic, Emily handled the samples with precision. She wore blue latex gloves, her auburn hair tied back, glasses reflecting pale lamplight as she logged every entry. Location, date, sample integrity, chain of custody. Her fingers steady, her voice calm, but her eyes were fierce. This, she said, sealing the last envelope, is no longer just suspicion. She held up the sealed folder, official, labeled, authentic. It's evidence, she said, and it's going straight to the EPA. Ranger stood between them, poised, watchful, as if he knew the war had just changed shape. The town hall in Bozeman had never felt so full. Snow piled like forgotten ghosts along the window ledges, while inside, every wooden bench creaked under the weight of anxious bodies. People sat with their coats still on, breathing in silence thick enough to hear hearts beat. North Star had arrived in style, sleek black coats, polished shoes, and 3 lawyers with clipped speech and trimmed beards. At their center stood Gregory Hale, the corporate representative, a man in his early 50s with meticulously combed silver hair, a perfectly pressed charcoal suit, and sharp blue eyes that never blinked longer than necessary. His smile was designed, calculated, and bought. He spoke with the confidence of someone who believed the room already belonged to him. North Star, he announced smoothly, has always supported Bozeman. Jobs, water treatment, community outreach, and now, clean energy. He presented slides, charts, smiling photos of children on field trips, farmers shaking hands with executives. His voice was silk-wrapped steel when he spoke Ethan's name. A troubled veteran, Hale said, with a show of concern. A man battling ghosts from wars long past. Brave, yes, but unstable. Inventive? Perhaps too inventive. Murmurs spread. Ethan stood near the back, wearing his worn green coat, one hand resting lightly on Ranger's head. His right palm was still in a bandage, evidence of crawling across frozen ice to collect samples. The accusations came like hail. He falsified evidence. He's inciting fear. He exploits animals for attention. The room shifted uncomfortably. Some looked away, some whispered. No one stood up, not yet. Ethan finally walked forward, Ranger pacing steadily beside him. He didn't speak, not at first. He just stood. His coat was frayed, boots worn, hair tousled by wind and hard nights. But his eyes were clear. Ranger stood beside him like a silent oath, amber gaze locked on Hale. The room held its breath. And then, before Ethan could speak, another set of footsteps echoed across the old hardwood floor. Not heavy, not hurried, but official, purposeful. 3 figures entered, navy blue jackets, yellow letters. EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. At their lead was Agent Marcus Reed, a tall, angular man in his late 40s, skin dark bronze, clean-shaven, with intelligent, steady green eyes framed behind thin glasses. His presence didn't demand attention, it commanded silence. He carried a stack of sealed folders and a voice sharpened by law, not threat. Behind him walked Sarah Whitfield, an investigative journalist, mid-30s, tall, sharp-featured, with shoulder-length blonde hair and pale freckled skin. Her camera crew followed, recording. She looked calm, but her expression held a fierce focus, the kind of fire found in people who expose truths, no matter the cost. Agent Reed faced the hall, then Hale. His tone was measured. The EPA regional office has received confirmed lab results identifying hazardous quantities of cadmium, chromium, and benzene, a known carcinogen, in this lake's waters. Gasps. Papers shifted. Chairs squeaked. The chemical signature matches discharge from North Star's main processing unit. He stepped closer to Hale. A warrant has been issued. Your facility is officially under federal investigation. You could feel the silence split, the sound of truth landing. Reed turned to the crowd. As of today, the lake is protected property. All discharge routes will be inspected, sealed, and documented. All affiliated legal records are now under evidence protection. It wasn't thunderous. It was surgical, precise, final. Sarah Whitfield's camera light blinked red, recording every flicker of truth. Hale's carefully constructed calm began to fracture. His hands tightened, jaw clenched, but he said nothing. His polished language had been replaced by forced silence. And then, something rare happened. People in the crowd began sitting straighter, breathing deeper, looking at one another instead of away. Some clapped, not many, not loud, but it grew. Not because their fear was gone, but because they had now understood something crucial. They no longer feared alone. That night, as the snow softened the world outside, Ethan stood by the shelter. Ranger ran freely in the snow-covered yard, no longer weak, no longer uncertain. Children from the town, some who once looked at the lake with hidden fear, now threw sticks for him, laughing. The Gomez family planted young trees along the thawing banks of the lake, willow, birch, and apple. Emily installed new kennels, their wood clean and bright, smelling of cedar and paint. The lake itself was quiet, but not silent, quiet in the way a wound begins to close. Ethan stood at the doorway of the restored shelter, hands deep in the pockets of his green coat, watching Ranger dash through falling snow with a joy that felt like redemption. He looked across the people working together, hands that once hid fear now planting roots, and he knew the truth. Peace is not the absence of conflict. It is knowing why you are willing to fight, and knowing you don't fight alone. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive with thunder, blazing light, or angelic trumpets. Sometimes, they arrive quietly, on 4 weary paws, wearing scars instead of wings. In a snowy town where fear once spoke louder than truth, a few ordinary hearts chose to protect what was right. They didn't have wealth, power, or influence, but they had loyalty, compassion, faith, and a dog who listened when everyone else stayed silent. Maybe that's how God works in our world, not always through mighty signs, but through honest people who refuse to look away, through kindness offered at the right moment, through the courage to speak when it would be easier not to. Perhaps miracles don't change the world all at once. Perhaps they simply show us where to stand and whisper, "Do not fear. You are not alone." If this story touched your heart, even quietly, share it so it may reach someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment, tell us your thoughts or your own story of courage, faith, or the dog that changed your life. Subscribe so these stories of healing, loyalty, and quiet miracles can keep traveling further than we ever could alone. May God bless you, protect your family, and watch over all those who guard the voiceless, because sometimes He sends help not in the shape of angels, but in the loyalty of a friend with 4 paws.